네, 저희가 그 앞에서
Ladies and
간단하게
gentlemen,
테크니컬적으로 좀 확인할 부분들이 있어서
we confirmed some several technical issues,
살짝 늦어졌습니다. 지금
and we are running late, 2 minutes.
카메라를 좀 받고 있고 조금 더
We are still receiving our participants, and after 2 minutes, when everybody's joined us, we're going to begin our event in Colloquium in 2 minutes.
분들께 이제 간단하게 좀 안내를
And before we begin, I'd like to make a housekeeping announcement that
참가자 채팅 화면목 공유 기록 있는데요. 거기에 이제 한국어라고 써 있습니다. 그래서
if you look at the bottom of the Zoom window,
한국말로 들으실 수 있고요.
you can select the language of interpretation. So if you'd like to listen to English channel, please click English. So if I say in Korean, then our interpreter is going to interpret for Professor Nicholas. And when Professor Nicholas says something in English, then we're going to interpret in Korean for you. In 1 minute, we're going to begin the colloquium.
네네. 네, 중간중간 이제 들어오셔서 이제 카메라를 켜고 계신 분들도 계시고 또
I
성함만으로
see some faces, and I also can see some names, and I see some familiar faces here. And also I see new faces. It's not like rigid discussion session. I'd like to make inviting and friendly environment here. As a moderator, I think I get too nervous, but let's make this a casual occasion, friendly environment. And we are now holding this event in cooperation with the Gyeonggi Research Institute, People for Earth and Energy Transition Korea. We have Professor Nicholas joined us here and waiting for the session to begin. So now let's begin. Nice to meet you. We are going to now begin the 5th Climate Change Colloquium. Nice to meet you. My name is Im Jae-min, Secretary General of Energy Transition Forum, and the concept of topic of today's session is urban community leading sensible practices in the era of climate crisis. So we're holding this event in cooperation organized by Gyeonggi Research Institute and People for Earth and Energy Transition Korea. And this colloquium is provided in 2 languages. So if you need Korean service, please click the globe sign for Korean translation. And if you find English more comfortable, please go to English channel. And if you have problems with technical, if you have technical issues, please let us know. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce this colloquium for us to respond to climate change that we'd like to here discuss holistic discussions so that we can come up with practical solutions which are designed to make real changes in our life. And this session is the 5th one. And from the 4th one that we talked about scientific facts, and also we also discussed about the theories of justice and the conflicts regarding the justice. And during the last session that we talked about the energy justice. Of course, it is important for us to learn about science facts, but also at the same time that we need to know what are the conflicts in the process of transition. So how can we be more fair in making the transition? So this is the 5th time, and we are honored to have Professor Kimberly Nicholas. She is a professor at Lund University, and she's also the author of Under the Sky, We Make How to Be Human in a Warming World. So we're going to learn about how, as citizens, we have the agency of power. Although I don't know everything about the all climate change related seminars or discussions, but I think it's really fresh to that we can approach this issue with feelings and emotions. So I think this is really fresh. And Professor Kimberly has been dedicated to climate change, and she realized that delivering knowledge only based on the scientific, that she realized that it's difficult to go closer to citizens. So based on her reflections and based on her life journey, that she has reflected that experience on her book. So as soon as the book was released, her book became the world of the became very famous in the Western sides. So if you're frustrated about climate issues, that you are most welcome to hear Professor Nicholas's presentation. And this, in this session that we are privileged to have Professor Kimberly Nicholas. And rather than thinking about you are here to learn about scientific facts, but we will be honored to listen to her stories and her journeys. And there must be frustrations and also the concerns that you must have in terms of climate change. So we're going to contemplate the issues together, and as colleagues and as part of the community, that we're going to work together toward the climate change issues. And we have panelists, 3 panelists. And the reporter, journalist Kim, is joining us at Gyeongyang newspaper, and also representing Gyeonggi Research Institute. We are privileged to have Dr. Go Jae-kyung, who is dedicated to designing climate change related policies. And also that there is a youth organization who is dedicated to fighting climate change. And we have Ms. Jo Eun-byul of Big Wave. Yeah, suddenly the main microphone is off. The main microphone is muted. After you introduce me, that you were cut off. Okay, thanks for letting me know. So I hope that Ms. Jo is well. All right, so the moderator shouldn't talk too much. Right, thank you. I hope that you can hear me. Then can you please show me a positive sign? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So now let's have Professor Nicholas, and we'd like to have her delivering her wonderful presentation. I would appreciate if you could introduce yourself and then start the presentation.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to join you, and I appreciate the work of the host and the interpreter to invite me, and for the beautiful tour of the building. I had a virtual tour before we began here. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Do you see my slides well? Yes, perfect. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and begin, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I come from a town called Sonoma. It's about an hour north of San Francisco in California. This is my parents' vineyard where they grow grapes, and this was the topic of my PhD. I studied the impacts of climate change on the California wine industry. And I chose this topic because it really links people, climate, and land, which are my main interests. How can we live more in harmony with nature and do a better job than we currently are? At the moment, the news is very alarming. We know that humans are causing climate change. We are seeing the effects around us. This has hit very close to home for me when my family was evacuated by wildfires in California in 2017. I'm very thankful that they were safe, but many friends and neighbors were not so lucky in losing homes and even lives to wildfires that are made worse and more likely by human-caused climate change. So we really happen to be alive at this critical moment for life on Earth, and our actions now and in the next few months and years really determine the conditions for civilization and life on Earth. So what I'll share with you today is what I see as our central task of being human in a warming world, and that is to stop global warming as fast as humanly possible, to stop biodiversity loss, the destruction of nature and the habitats and ecosystems and species that we share the planet with also has to stop if we want a good future. And really to shift our values, or rather align our values. I think we already have these values, but to shift our societies to be in line with centering well-being and health for both humans and nature. So I'll share today some facts, feelings, and action. This is the framework that I've used to structure my book and my newsletter, which is called We Can Fix It. And I think trying to weave together these three elements is really key for us to tackle the climate crisis. We can sum up the facts that everyone needs to know about climate change in just a few words. It's almost a haiku if you don't count the syllables too carefully. And what science tells us about climate change is it's warming, it's us, we're sure. It's bad, we can fix it. You may be familiar with the IPCC, the United Nations Climate Panel. They've released two big reports recently, one in August 2021, which is the physical science basis. That's summarizing thousands of studies and now over many, many decades, that it's certain that humans are warming the climate primarily by burning fossil fuels. And there's overwhelming, complete scientific consensus about that. The latest report, which came out just a few weeks ago, earlier this month, is sharing the news that it's bad. It's documenting how climate change already is hurting people and places around the world, and really highlighting how urgent it is that we make this transition to a fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world. On Monday, this coming Monday, the third and final report of the series will be released, and that's focused on what are the policies and practices and options we have to stop climate change. So I'll be sharing more about that next week. On Twitter, for example, I'll write a simple summary of what the latest report says. The bottom line is, to stop warming, humans have to completely stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. So right now, if you think of our atmosphere like a bathtub, the sources of climate pollution come from, again, primarily burning fossil fuels, and that's our transport and energy systems, for example. Nature is doing a huge service by removing about half of the carbon that we put in the atmosphere. So pollution is going in, that's like water from the tap. Carbon is being taken out by the oceans and land, but about half of the carbon that humans add to the atmosphere, emit to the atmosphere, remain there. And that means if you think of the balance between what's coming in and being removed, the water level in the bathtub, or the carbon level in our atmosphere, is rising. And we're now very close to this limit of the tub, the edge that we don't want to spill over. And that limit, as set by the Paris Agreement and international climate policy, is to limit warming well below 2 degrees and pursue 1.5. And we know from science since the Paris Agreement, from the IPCC and others, that really the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, it may sound very small, but it truly is the difference between life and death for people and places around the world. So we really have to fight as hard as we can to limit warming as much as possible. Right now, things have been improving, but we're still headed for catastrophic climate change. So this graph shows emissions over time. And the upper level here, the blue wedge, is where we were headed before as a world before the Paris Agreement. You can see that this blue triangle, policies have been implemented that reduce emissions, and that is good news. Pledges from the latest international negotiations in Glasgow, held late last year, further went in the right direction. But we still have this remaining gap, this turquoise, greenish blue triangle shape here. And that's where we need to get to successfully stop warming. So things have been going in the right direction, but too slowly, and we really need to speed them up. This is another way of saying the same thing. Maybe I won't go into too much detail other than just to say current policies are headed for somewhere around 2.5 or more degrees of warming. And we know that that would be catastrophic. So there's this gap that really has to be met in the next few years. And that is our only option to avoid going above 1.5 degrees and sustaining that damage. It would have been a lot easier if we had started earlier, because we could have reduced emissions more slowly. That's the point of this graph. If you look back at the year 2000, if we had started reducing emissions then and making this transition off of fossil fuels, it could have been more gradual, because what matters is the area under this curve. But given that we have not done that, emissions have been going up, and we now are at this really last second where it's still physically possible to reduce emissions before we overstep that edge of the bathtub, that 1.5 degree limit. We need to actually be reducing emissions in industrialized countries around 10 to 12% per year. It's about 1% per month. It's a very big rate of change we need to be making. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can get into the details, but the big picture of what will stop climate change is to stop burning fossil fuels and to stop destroying nature. That's the bottom line. About 3/4 of our climate pollution comes from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And the remaining 1/4 comes from land use and agriculture, especially animal agriculture. So these are the systems that we need to change. And basically our goal is keep a good life for everybody on Earth, improve living conditions for those who don't have enough, reduce overconsumption for those of us who are taking more than our fair share, and deliver what we need to have a good life in a way that isn't polluting the climate and is respecting nature. This means excuse me. Pardon me. This means we need to stop the production and consumption of fossil fuels. I write a lot in the book about my anger at the fossil fuel companies who have been documented now for many decades to have a disinformation campaign that discredits science that their own reports show to be true, and that is aiming to delay the necessary transition of leaving fossil fuels in the ground. So absolutely, we need to hold polluters accountable. We also need to look at consumption, and basically this whole system from production to consumption has to move away from fossil fuels. How are we going to do that? Well, I have a suggestion. Basically, my diagnosis is the root cause of many of our problems is two fundamentally flawed assumptions, which I call the exploitation mindset. The exploitation mindset is based on the idea that some humans are superior to others, and that humans in general are superior to and should dominate nature. And I think this mindset of exploitation and hierarchy and dominance of other people and nature is the root cause of our climate crisis and other injustices. So my suggestion for how we start to dismantle this mindset and instead build one of regeneration, which is about improving and striving to better the world and ourselves, that relies on three principles. First, it's about respecting and caring and protecting and putting at the heart of everything we do, the well-being of people and nature. Second, it's about stopping harm at the source, looking at systems holistically and getting to the root cause of problems rather than playing whack-a-mole, trying to treat the symptoms at the end of the pipeline. And third, it's about building resilience. So resilience is the capacity to recover from stress and even to thrive through change. And this is both for ourselves personally, taking care of ourselves and others, for communities and cities where we live and work, and for nature. We need to strengthen our ties with each other and our basically ability to cope in order to deal with stresses and help each other. So those are the facts. What about the feelings? I have a lot to say here, and I write about this every month in We Can Fix It. But one of my primary feelings around climate change is grief at the loss of places and systems that I love. I've seen this in losing the taste of some of my favorite wines in California to a warming climate, and to this mountain peak in Sweden, which I climbed with my husband in 2019. And shortly after we climbed, I didn't make it to the very top. I didn't have the right equipment and was scared of this big slope here. And I thought, oh, I can come back next year. 2020 didn't work out as expected in many ways, but it still would not have been possible to climb to this mountain peak because it wasn't there anymore. This glacier on top of the mountain of Sweden's highest mountain has melted to the point that it's no longer Sweden's highest mountain. So we see the maps need to be redrawn, the world around us is changing, and it's important, I think, to name and create space to grieve those losses and to motivate what we love, or to honor what we love, and to let that motivate us to fight to protect what we can. It's also been really devastating for me to see the changes to my beloved home state of California, where my family still lives, to these catastrophic wildfires. This orange sky in San Francisco was caused by particle pollution from fires in the area. And it feels really dystopic and surreal to see this beautiful place being affected in this way. So I write about my experiences of encountering these fires and talking about how I think what we need to do is develop the capacity to view reality as it is without distortion or judgment, to help us change what we can to fight for what we love, and also to accept what we can't change. And finding this balance, I think, is a really tricky, important skill. I read about 5 stages of what I call radical climate acceptance, the process and the ongoing practice of trying to find this balance. First is ignorance. We have to learn about climate change from somewhere. Second is avoidance. And I myself was stuck in this phase for a long time, that it feels more, eventually, it feels more uncomfortable to continue to avoid discussing and facing the truth than to actually do it. Third, then, as a phase can be doom. And this is where I hear from a lot of people who wake up to this urgency and scale of the climate crisis, start Googling and freak out. And I think it's important that we recognize and support each other, that we don't minimize the severity of the crisis, but we also find ways to face bad news and to find meaning and purpose and keep going. And the thing that will help us do that is all the feels, facing and sitting with our feelings, basically, from grief about loss to anger about injustices to courage and community and creativity and all the other things that the climate crisis can help us build. So ultimately, it helps us, or the aim is to find our climate purpose. And that will look a little different for each of us because we all have different skills, we all have different talents. So basically our task is to figure out, what is it that I can bring to the climate party? How can I contribute? What do I offer? And how can I contribute that to fighting climate change and supporting the team who's doing that? So then let me talk for the rest of my time about action. We've faced our feelings, we've honored what we care about, we've identified what we love and our reason why we want to fight for stopping climate change. How are we going to do it? We can talk about this on many levels, but here I'll focus on what we as individuals can do and how it is that individuals can actually drive system change. What is our role in building collective change? With colleagues a few months ago, we published this paper where we argued there are 5 key roles that we can play to fight climate change. And these are as a consumer, an investor, a role model, our work in organizations like work or school, and as citizens. We shared this work both in our scientific publication. I wrote about it in my We Can Fix It newsletter. We wrote a popular science piece for New Scientist. It actually was picked up by the Netflix film Don't Look Up and used as the basis for their recommendation for climate action. But I'll share our take on it here. So first, as a consumer, this is not the only way we affect the climate, but it's an important one to address. I think something really important to recognize is how unequal the world is. And that it's really a relatively small group of people and countries that have caused most of the climate crisis. When we look at this graph, this is showing on the x-axis here, how much resources is a country consuming? And it's based on this concept of planetary boundaries, that we live on a limited, finite planet that only has so many resources, and we can't consume more water or emit more climate pollution or use more land than nature can actually handle and incorporate in regenerative cycles. At the same time, we want to provide a good life for everybody. And so these social thresholds on the y-axis are about scores like democracy, equality, jobs and well-being, health, social connection. So what we want is a world where everybody has all their social needs met and the planet is doing well. We're not over any limits. That's this empty circle in the upper corner here. What we have at the moment is poor countries who generally are treading lightly on the earth, but are not meeting the social needs of their citizens. And then we have rich countries who are doing pretty well at meeting social needs, but at the expense of the planet, which ultimately is unsustainable. So basically our job is to try and get the whole world into this country, into this empty corner at the moment, and create a trajectory for example, wealthy and industrialized countries to maintain a good standard of living while radically reducing our consumption. And for, for low-income countries to increase their consumption somewhat in order to meet the material basic needs of their citizens, while also greatly improving social indicators. This is what the world looks like today. It's both unequal and unsustainable. We have a huge inequality in the world where about 1 billion people enjoy a really comfortable, high consuming standard of living. About 1 billion people live in extreme poverty where they don't have enough food, they don't have safe and sufficient shelter, they don't have clothing or even shoes that are adequate. People may need to walk long distances, often women and girls, to collect water for the household, for example. So basically eliminating poverty, providing a good standard of living, and while reducing overconsumption is what we're aiming for. And you can see how this is so urgent because you see that it's actually a relatively small share of the population here on the left, these yellow and red bars, which are 10% of the global population, who are emitting half of household climate pollution. So this is the group to which I belong that needs to reduce our consumption. We need to then, and you see here this per capita, the share per person for this high income group is something like 20 times over the sustainable limit if we want to meet the Paris Agreement. So we need to both increase consumption for those in extreme poverty, and that will not increase emissions very much because their emissions are so low, while decreasing consumption for these upper groups. And that to be in the top 10% globally, you need to earn over $38,000 per year. I'm here in Sweden, that's below the median income. So the majority of Swedes actually fall in this top 10%. So what is it that we can do if we're in this high consuming group? Well, when you look at personal carbon footprints, you see that the majority, especially as income increases here, come from mobility, from flying and driving. And this is what really convinced me to go on a journey to fly less, because I was in this group where the majority of my emissions, the biggest share of emissions as a former frequent flyer, were from flying. So even though flying is globally a small percentage of emissions, for those of us who fly, it's probably the largest part of our personal footprints and the fastest way we can reduce our own climate pollution. Driving comes next for those who fly a lot, and it's the biggest source of emissions for those who don't fly a lot but do drive. So that's another big one. Meanwhile, we have this group for those who are not in the top 10%, system change is probably enough to get to where we need to be. In other words, if we have energy systems that aren't burning fossil fuels, if we have regenerative agriculture that is not much more plant-based and is not contributing so much climate pollution and is restoring and protecting nature, the current level of consumption for these groups is broadly consistent with stabilizing the climate. But we will also have to tackle overconsumption by the top groups in order to actually stabilize the climate. So what we did in a 2017 study was identify the personal climate actions that have the biggest impact. And we found that those are to go flight, car, and meat free. So those are the three areas where we have a pretty high degree of personal control and where our personal choices link with the system. So if that feels too far to go completely flight free, for example, I decided myself to stop flying within Europe in 2012. I've reduced my flying about 95%, but I haven't stopped entirely. It's something I'm still working on. And that is really worth doing. It's much better to make progress than to demand perfection and not get started. In terms of diet, making plants really the center of most meals is a really important shift. This is the suggestion for a healthy and sustainable diet where most of your plate would be taken up by fruits and vegetables, about half your plate. And if animal products are included, they would be something like an accent or a highlight rather than the center or the majority of the plate. A rule of thumb is no more than 1 glass of milk per day, 2 eggs and 2 servings of fish and chicken per week, and 2 burgers per month. Beef has by far the highest climate and environmental impact, so it's the most important to limit. What about as investors? Well, we might not be Warren Buffett or sort of global, huge investors, but we might have pensions and be part of organizations that do. And there, what we do really matters. So what's high impact in terms of investment, most big banks are still funding fossil fuels. They're still building pipelines and financing expansion of fossil fuels that the climate cannot afford to burn. So divestment campaigns play a really important role, both personally, as I've done for my own money, and as supporting organizations like my university to divest. Another option for those who can afford it is to support charities, climate charities, and charities working for causes that you value. And I'm working towards donating 10% of my income per year to charities to try and make a positive impact with my money, not just avoid making a negative one by supporting fossil banks. Something we might not think about is how important we are as role models. And of course, the bigger the platform we have, the more responsibility and opportunity we have there. But all of us are role models to someone. And the closer, we know from research that people are most affected by the people in their immediate area. So family and friends, people you have close contact with, those are your most trusted sources of advice and as role models. So I think it's important to think about, for example, what we post on social media. Are we glamorizing high carbon tropical beach vacations, which continues to support this norm of over-consuming our fair share of carbon? Or are we finding adventures that are closer to home and finding ways to make those appealing and meaningful? If you can, to pledge to stay on the ground or fly less and publicly talk about that decision, we know that that makes a really big impact on others. So this ripple effect is really big. And I think talking about climate is a really big role that we can play in our daily conversations, raising the issue and finding ways to weave it into our daily lives. The picture is of my expired frequent flyer card, which expired shortly after my trip to Korea, where I taught for a summer school at Kyunghee University, which I loved and very much enjoyed, but also realized couldn't keep this kind of extremely hypermobile frequent flyer lifestyle to be in line with my values. So that card is now in a museum of climate change. It's a museum called Carbon Ruins that looks back from 2053 on the ridiculous things that we did in the fossil fuel era, like support more flying to incentivize carbon pollution. As a part of organizations like this one, like school and work and other communities that you're a part of, people can have a really big impact. And there, I recommend taking a look at the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That's the most complete and comprehensive way that companies can align not just greenwashing, but really in a meaningful way, pledge and plan and start to reduce their emissions in the way that science demands for us to actually meet the Paris Agreement targets. And I also really recommend for employees this guide, Climate Solutions at Work from Project Drawdown. That really helps break down what is it that I can do as an accountant, as someone in human resources, as a boss, as an employee in different roles of an organization. How do you turn those roles towards climate action? And finally, our role as citizens is so important. And this is a really critical way where personal action gets scaled to collective action. We know from research that political action really matters. The most important and most effective way to engage is to vote. And studies show that voting for women and voting for politicians with good climate scores actually reduces emissions. It's also important to get involved in political parties or climate organizations. So this group has a big advantage. Having a network where you can plan and do things together really makes a difference. Creating media attention, whether it's writing a letter to the editor of your local paper or being active on social media, and writing and calling your representatives. So actually contacting the people in your political system who represent you. It's really important that they hear from ordinary citizens. They hear a lot from really well-organized and well-funded lobby groups who are lobbying to keep the unsustainable system as it is. And they need to hear more from ordinary voters who care about the climate, are prepared to vote on the climate, and let them know we support you taking really substantial, bold climate action, and we will vote for you if you do. And finally, political demonstrations. These are what's been shown to actually move the needle. So I want to close and move into the conversation now and just reflect for a minute on how important it is that we take this opportunity we have to be good ancestors, that we are at this critical moment for life on Earth. That includes humanity, human civilization. It includes the 8 million other species that we share the planet with. And basically, we're setting the thermostat for who can live where and how we can make a living. That's fundamentally what climate does. So our choices now in this last critical window, these last few moments really of our remaining carbon budget are so important. We really matter, and the climate really needs you to engage. So I'm really heartened to hear from groups around the world like yours and learn more about what you're doing. And I'll look forward to the discussion. If you want to learn more, I'm very happy if you have a look at my book, and you're very welcome to join my community where I write monthly actionable advice on what does the evidence say we can do, how can we take facts and feelings and turn them to action. So that's called We Can Fix It. The next issue will be out tomorrow, and maybe I can paste the link in the chat for those who are interested. But I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Through one social media, I read one sentence that I want to do something critical for climate change limitation, and our roles are all different. Somebody can be political leader, or somebody are an organization. And she said that it looks like citizens are not included in the discussion for climate change. And yeah, as an activist, that I felt really sorry to hear that, because citizens should be part of this big discussion, and our role is to present the actions that we can take. So by listening to your presentation, that brought me, reminding me of that social media that's the writing and post. And yes, your presentation made me think a lot about it. And so we're going to now start the discussion, and I'd like to welcome our panelists. And we have journalist Kim from Gyeongyang newspaper, and she's been dedicating to writing about climate change issues. Nice to meet you. I don't know if you can hear me well. My name is Kim Han-sol. I'm a reporter representing Gyeongyang newspaper, and I loved your presentation. As a reporter, that I am writing about articles about climate change issues, and whenever I write articles as a reporter, that I am standing on the lines between delivering scientific facts and giving warnings to citizens. That is one of my roles. And of course, it's my obligation. But although I put that information into an easier form to help students digest, and I quite doubt about it, because the scientific facts are quite difficult. And the reason I'm concerned about it is because the climate change issues are quite different from other articles or other issues. The climate change issues have special substance itself, because it's so heavy. The subject itself is so heavy that affects all of our lifestyles. And whenever I give some kind of warning message, it means the citizens rectify their lifestyle. So rather than providing fact-based articles, I'm not sure what would be the good balance. And by listening to your presentation, that I've learned a lot, and your presentation resonated me a lot. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you. And before I listen to Professor Nicholas, I'd like to invite other panelists too. And we have other panelists joining here. Do we have other panelists here? Okay. So we're going to turn off the slide and so that we can see our faces better. And we have Ms. Cho Eun-byul. She's representing youth. She is from Youth Climate Change Action Group, Big Wave. Actually, my internet connection is unstable. So if you have problems, please let me know. And for the time being, I'm so happy that your presentation, your lecture was wonderful. And you had touched many things that I agreed with. And there were many concerns that I had as an activist. And you mentioned that the polluters, the high polluters have to reduce their carbon emissions. But my colleague activists, and besides my other colleagues, but like normal citizens, my friends, that they are not concerned about climate change at all. So I am in the core of activism, but if I go one step out, then nobody is concerned about it. But if normal citizens read books like your book, then I'm sure that they would do some actions. But if they don't get access to the book like Under the Sky We Make, I have all confidence that they're all human and then they would like to do actions, but they just don't get the access. I don't know, they have just no interest in here. So how can I make them interested in such a difficult subject? And I read your book and take this opportunity. I'd like to ask you, how can we make people get interested in looking at the facts and the actions that we have to take collectively? How can we make them be part of our discussion? Because actually, it was a question, and I hope to hear your answer later, Professor Nicholas. All right. Since she asked the question, if Professor Nicholas, if you don't mind, can you please answer that question first before I introduce another panelist?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for these important interventions. So the question about how can I make other people care, I think is so important. What the research tells us is that we need to start where they are. So it's more about listening and asking questions in conversations with people you know and trust and have a relationship with. That's really how you change hearts and minds. So I think it takes a lot of work, but I think you can find shared values and concerns. So the things that, for example, I mean, one reason I studied wine and climate change is because I love wine. And I know many people who also love wine, and it's an important product from the region where I come from. It's an important part of tradition and the landscape. So there are many people who care about wine. And that was the reason I chose it, because I knew that it was something important to me that I could talk about with passion, and that passion also connects with other people's passion. So I think the answer there is it's not a one size fits all. There's no one answer that it's always this formula or this particular phrase, but it's finding genuine connection and using that as a bridge to link to your care and concern about climate. I think I can just recommend a really good guide called Talking Climate from a group, Climate Outreach, in the UK. They have a really effective way of breaking it down in 8 steps, and here's how to prepare, here's how to think about it. So I think there are good guides out there, and I hope that's a beginning of an answer. Thank you so much for your work and your activism.
감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the question and answer. Well, my concern recently is that for the tipping point, I just had some concern how I can deliver the tipping point easily to the general public. Once we are going beyond that tipping critical point, then we never be going back to the place where we used to be. So whenever I have a chance to deliver the lectures, if I deliver long story, people get bored and they are lost in the middle. So I had a lot of thought how I can improve that area. So while reading your book, I got some ideas. Oh, you know, when we take the elements from structure, then it seems like it will collapse very soon. But it remains the structure. But as we are getting the elements out one by one, then at one moment it collapses out of nowhere. So that's the critical point, and that's the tipping point. So it's important to deliver scientific evidence, but it is also all the more important to deliver the feelings and emotions based on or out of or beyond the scientific evidence. So I think that is one good approach to talk about the climate from the emotion perspective. So if, Professor, if you have some opinions or some guidelines for us to share, then you can just share that with us later. And now I would like to open the floor to the professor and the PhD Go Jae-kyung, the researcher at the Gyeonggi Research Institute. And many are saying that the communications that have been made by a scientist, they have been a big failure because they just focus on the scientific fact. So they just delete all the emotions, but they try to deliver the facts. So their communication was not effective. So you, as a scientist, how do you think about this kind of critics? So can you just give us some couple of comments on that? All right. Thank you for that kind of the question. Once again, thank you for inviting me here. I am responsible for sustainable development and energy and climate transition. I am studying the policy, so I usually do so many brain work. And when I preparing the research report, and to support the informed decision, we try to find some fact. So that is kind of obsession that we are having. From the perspective, today's colloquium is about how we can change our action to stop climate crisis. And it gave us a new insight and new perspective. So based on the lessons we learned, I think it will give me a lot of fresh eyes when I will deliver my policy research in the future. And to cut the GHG emissions, you calculate how and where you can cut the emissions, and you just put that into the practice, and that is really impressive. And IPCC 6 report shows us how dramatic condition we are standing at, and that sends us a very drastic alarm bell. And more than half of the carbons in the atmosphere have been emitted in the last 3 decades. That means after we recognize the serious condition of the pollution or the ecological crisis, we haven't made any actions. If we have a lot of evidences out there, and we try to deliver that information to the public, and as a result, the public awareness have been enhanced. But that's the end. They haven't put that into their practice. It is same at the individual level and the country or social level. So scientific information is important, but the next approach that we have to have is that to turn that information into the practice, we have to find that triggering point to encourage people to take on action. So climate crisis is really tricky. And compared to the COVID-19 pandemic, people take on action and they can see the result immediate time and place. They can see the result after taking an action. So it's kind of easier to encourage people to call for action. But if we reduce the GHG emission, but the result was not appearing to us right away. So it takes a lot of time to see the result. And it has been in place in quite a long ago. So it's pretty vague. That's why people consider it a future issue, not the present issue. So the characteristics of a climate crisis is kind of the hold many people back. So we have to break down the climate crisis issue a little bit further. In the era of a climate crisis, the citizens should take more action in their daily lives. If we think about that, as Professor Kimberly highlighted, communication is the key, I think. I am not saying that scientific evidence is not important. That is really important. But the more important thing is that how we can processing and fabricating that information to encourage people to take an action. To encourage people to take an action, we have highlighted the education is important. However, there are not many programs and some kind of tools to support that. So those who have been affected by climate change can be very active, but depending on the income level or educational background, even though we are sending the same message, their reaction is totally different. So we have to also categorize and break down the demographic characteristics, and depending on that, we can deliver the customized information. So from the perspective, storytelling is important that I always highlight. You know, the storytelling is really tricky because how you deliver the story, people's reaction is totally different. So we have to study and we have to access from the psychological perspective as well. So if we are delivering the story, if the story can be relatable to that individual, then they can take some action. So the story should be based on the real case and the real the experiences. Then the efficacy and the effectiveness of the story will be more the higher. So by doing so, we have to help people to recognize where we are standing at from the climate crisis perspective. The another thing that I'm currently thinking about is that we have to deliver many cases to the public. There was a Sopo Home network in Britain. In Sopo Home is not like traditional housing. Their GHG emission has been cut by 60%. So it's a high efficiency energy transition home. So if you mark the Sopo Home area on the map, then people can go and visit to see that. They just go there to ask what their experiences are. And the homeowners tell their stories, what kind of benefit they can get. So by doing so, throughout the dialogue, they can get how they can build another energy efficient housing by themselves. So after visiting that actual housing, many are changing their facilities or equipment to energy efficient one. So we can just deliver the very practical and the the tangible ideas and the practice cases, then people can take some actions because they understand how they can change the reality. And the message deliverer who are sending the message is also important. There are so many different routes people get the message. If they get the message from the people they trust in and who have similar values, then they tend to believe in and take some actions. And that's another good point. So instead of an individual level, I think a community level of communication is better to trigger some collective actions. Individual can carry out 5 different roles according to your presentation. An individual can carry out multiple roles in their daily lives. At the same time, these kind of actions can be organized to enhance their influence. So we have to have some kind of a systematic approach that can be made at the organization level, like a community or a church or the religious group or some the company things, schools, things like that. To vitalize that organization, the trust between people should be kind of guaranteed, which is a so-called social asset or social resources. So we have to make an investment into the social resources. In the Gyeonggi-do area, we are very active for the people and citizens to take part in some the initiatives led by the government or the local agency. Many Gyeonggi residents are very active and they are passionate about to make some energy transition. So when we have some interview with them, their motivation is very diverse. And some of them are producing the solar-based power. By doing so, they just understand the value of the energy to the community and to the economy. And so the values are very diverse. And by taking actions, they have specific goals. And that goal also is very diverse. So if we understand that better, then we can persuade them more effectively. Last but not least, citizens should change their lifestyle and should change their options for sustainability. The individual action is important, but at the same time, we have to expand their range of options that should be supported by the system. Of course, we can change the system collectively, but to support the people to opt for the alternative lifestyle, we have to provide diverse types of energies at the community level. So that's one thing we have to consider altogether. So I fully understand the importance of communication of a climate crisis, but how we can do you have some specific cases that we can learn from? So that is my question to you, Professor Kimberly. That's it.
So a lot of information was shared. So the information was helpful to the participants in Korea, and also it was a good opportunity to Professor Nicholas to learn about the situations in Korea. And at the end of the part that she also asked the question to Professor Nicholas. So if you can cover that, that will be wonderful. Professor?
Yes, so wow, so much to respond to, but I think believe I'm just being asked to address the specific question about cases. Yes, I actually have a big focus on cases of success stories in my research, because I think it's very important that we identify bright spots. What we need to do is look where things are working, figure out why they're working, and how to scale them up and out. And it's not just a cut and paste process, because we have to take local conditions into account, but I think it's really important to be inspired by successes. So one answer to your question, we have a study in press that I hope will be out very soon, a few weeks perhaps, that I'm also writing about in The Conversation, which is a popular science forum, and hopefully will make it into other newspapers. That study is about what cities in Europe have successfully reduced car use, because we know Europe actually has a goal, the European Union, to deliver 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. And this is a wonderful goal. We should absolutely do it. We're not yet on track to do it, and we need to go a lot faster and have much more ambitious policies and actions. I'm so sorry, much more ambitious policies and actions in place to actually achieve this. And one of the big challenges there will be reducing car dependence. So basically, we've identified 12 measures that successfully reduce car use in European cities. Some of the most effective were a congestion charge, like London has, that reduced cars 33% into the city center. Other really effective measures are charging for parking. I heard yesterday that a car in a city takes about 100 square meters of space to have parkings and roads available. And that's quite a nice sized apartment or a lovely park. Or if we think about, the value of land in cities and what else we could do with that land besides provide space for a heavy piece of metal that 95% of the time is parked and 95% of the energy that it uses is moving the car itself around rather than the passengers. There are many more efficient ways we could use our space and resources. So charging for parking, basically having policies that are both carrots and sticks. So building and supporting infrastructure like bike lanes, pedestrian walkways, public transit that is attractive and convenient and easy and cheap or free to use, along with the sticks of making it more expensive and difficult to do the polluting thing like driving private cars. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So the parking lot issue is very serious in Korea, and especially the capital city in Korea that we have 10 million citizens living in this capital. So we have parking issues, and many of the citizens are asking for more parking spaces actually. But in this case, that they are removing parking lots and they are utilizing the space for something else. And so I think that citizens in Korea also have to learn from it, because that we need to call for the right policy. Actually, that story is, although it's successful in Europe, I think that story sounds quite far, because that the calling of citizens is different, because based on certain emotions, based on certain realities, that the calling for certain policy is made. However, in Korea, the situation is different. So I'd like to ask for more questions about the situations and how to engage citizens to feel necessary for their obligations. So I'd like to ask Ms. Cho, because she is engaging with youth, and the concerns in the minds of young people in Korea. And what are the efforts that you are putting in to convey the concerns of young people to the political scene? And what are the concerns? Do you think your voice is heard in the political scene, or what are the major concerns of young people? And also, I'd like to ask reporter Kim here that she is dealing with a lot of climate issues. However, that when it comes to climate change, that we tend to deal with overseas articles or overseas news. For example, California, the wildfire, but here, reporter Kim is very working hard to provide the real cases in Korea and the people who are witnessing or who are actually experiencing the climate change issues in Korea. So I'd like to ask you if there is some cases that you'd like to share with the audiences. And I'd like to start with Ms. Cho.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
활동하고 있는 기후변화
Um,
실천 모임 비게이브라는 단체는
My youth organization named Big Wave
여러 사회적 관심사, 개인의 사회적 관심사를
works on social issues
좀 미션을 좀 가지고 있습니다.
based on individual needs and concerns. And our bigger purpose is to make a society where all citizens are prepared for climate change issues. And to fulfill the mission that we need to make consensus on our social issues. As Professor Nicholas mentioned, that we need to start with our personal interests, and if not, then the sustainability of that issue is weak. So it is important for us to start with our personal interests, whether it's planetary diet or whether it's travel or whether it's political issues. So in each area, for example, planetary diet, maybe we can start plant-based diet, or we can go to the National Assembly to ask for policies. So not only my organization, but also other organizations are making direct actions to deal with climate issues. For example, that they went to a company who is building a fossil fuel plant, and then they actually sprayed green sprayed on the wall, and then they are doing direct actions. So when I see their actions, that is I can feel their energy, but at the same time, as an activist who is working in this field about 3 years, and actually I am quite devastated, because although I work really hard, that our voices aren't not reflected, because I've seen so many hurdles to have our voices to be heard. And all those some political leaders have certain will that they are failing to overcome the opposition. So although one political leader has strong will, that because of the system tumbling blocks, that I see that our voice is not reflected in the actual political in actual policies. So although that we have wonderful ideas, for example, that okay, we need to have collective actions, and also we have to use less cars, but to make that to transform that into action, so not only our league, but to include the bigger league, to make that happen, that we need to a systematic approach, but there is a big gap between our voice and the policy. So when I go to a discussion session or symposiums, we often say that, okay, we need it. We have to do it. We always say that, okay, we have to do it. But that brings me a question. Then how can we make it possible? All right, we all know that it's necessary, but how can we make it possible to transform that into actions? What are the key ingredients that we need to have? So actually has made me devastated, but at the same time that despair and the urgency makes me to continue to work. I was holding one picket saying that, can I have a baby? Because the stress and the pressure on my shoulders were so heavy. So I was concerned about the future, worried about the future of my baby generations who leave, because we are under the burden and the stress. And then we are consuming the resources, and in this situation, we can make the change. We can make the future that we want. So I think it is a situation where I feel easily burnt out. So I'm living in this dilemma, and that is the difficulty that I'm going through at the moment. And as the last but not least, I want to emphasize this. I've been thinking about it, and I've been going through this for 3 years, and I have come to this conclusion. We have to make this happen in politics. I mean, this is not only in the hands of political leaders, but that includes bigger circle, that includes activists, and that includes political leaders. But how can we convince bigger people to make the system that we want? How can we have more people to engage in policy making, and how can we educate people? So it is important for people to experience the change. They need to taste the change, that we, with our hands, that we can make changes. So if we learn that, our baby steps can make big impact. If we learn that, we can make changes. So that is the end of my opinion. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
기자님도 같이.
Well, we have reporter Kim sitting next to me. So do you have any comment? So any questions in the climate crisis have been covered in my articles together with the Green Association of Korea. The reason why I started that series is that before becoming the special correspondent in environment, I just think about how many articles that I have read in the environment. So before I recognize that, I have not been interested in this issue. So that is my starting point. And I just ask this question to myself, why I haven't read it. The climate crisis is very serious, and this is the issue that we can fix and tackle. But I feel like it is very intangible because environment is not something we can touch and feel, but the environmental degradation is some very worrisome issue. But all the articles and on the newspaper about the environment is very negative. So I just try to avoid to reading it. And the other thing is that it is abstract. The climate crisis is invisible and people cannot relate it to it. And I think that fact itself might be misconception or prejudice because climate crisis is the present issue, not the future issue. Then why people say it is intangible and it is something that we cannot feel. So I think that's because many the articles would not touch upon the core value or the context why environment is important and where environment is related to our daily lives. Many of articles and headlines simply speaking that we have very serious wildfires and the crops are not growing well due to the environmental changes. But that is cannot be that much related to the daily life of people. So to deliver the information more effectively, we have to give the context. In a big context, we can deliver the story. Then maybe people's attitude towards environmental articles and stories might be changed. So as a creator of the contenter, as Professor Nicholas and the Dr. Chu and the activist Chu mentioned, my role is different from yours. And you are a scientist and researcher, and Joe, you are the activist, and you are a researcher. My role is that collecting all the information that you are feeding in and make another story to tell the public effectively. But article is limited to deliver the emotions. So we talk about the emotions about the climate crisis. What is impressing me is that all the interviewee says that they are the witness of the climate crisis. So the interviewee saying that when I just ask them to be interviewed with me regarding certain topic, then they are saying that I am not an expert of a climate change. I don't know about the climate crisis. You'd better to come to an expert to have a better interview. But if we deep dive into their daily life, actually all the things they are facing and experiencing is the result of climate change. And they also understand what is climate change, but they don't relate to climate change is related to their daily difficulties they are facing and they need to resolve. They do not just to see that nexus. So if some articles or contents are giving us some context on the human scale, then people may understand this issue better. And once we have that content or structure, then we can deliver many other stories more effectively related to it. So that's my idea. Well, thank you very much. And actually, mic is not working pretty well. Please bear with us. I think now you can hear us better. I am not accustomed to the system yet. Please bear with me. And Ms. Jo's story, actually, I'm not Sure. So we are having a little showers out there. So because of the rain, we just to kind of discourage it a little bit, dispirit it a little bit. Science, when we are trying to deliver the climate change, we have to focus on the people who are experiencing and also sometimes causing climate change. And so we can just see all different perspectives about the climate change, and all your comments are related to the lectures of Professor Kimberly, and the media outlet and the citizens activists and research center are doing their job to deliver better stories to the public. And before going to the Professor Kimberly, I think we have a lot of online participants and they just deliver many questions on the chat box. And so feel free to ask any questions on the chat box. And anyone who have left any questions, if you want to ask this question with your voice, then please raise your hand. Then we'd like to give you an opportunity to ask a question or share your opinions with your voice. And while you're preparing for that, so we will listen to your questions first and then move to the Kimberly. But while waiting for the questions, Professor Kimberly, do you have any feedback to the Ms. Cho and Dr. Cho and also the reporter Kim?
Yes, thank you. I would like to respond. I first want to speak with you, the activist from Big Wave, and I really appreciate and honor the work that you're doing. And I want to say it is really important and it does make a difference. But I also want to apologize that you are in this position because I think it is deeply unfair. It is not fair to you and your generation that you bear this burden and face this pressure. So I try to hold those two truths at the same time, that it is inspiring and impactful and necessary and important, the work that you do, but also I wish that you never had to do it. So with that said, I think it's very important that you take care of yourself to prevent burnout for your own sake and for the sake of the climate movement. And I think that's about a balance of finding what it is that gives you energy and where you see making a change. And I think the challenge of working at the policy level is that you very rarely see the change directly or quickly, and that can really contribute to burnout. So it's really important to keep working at those levels. And it's also important to keep working in ways where you feel you are building power and community and can see the change with your own hands, as you said yourself. So that's just a little bit of my reflections for you. I think we know from research that youth has a really powerful voice, that youth does change the conversation, that especially parents listen to their children, although that's not always true in my case, but that young people have a really powerful position of moral authority. And if we think about, I mean, the most powerful argument that convinces the most people is fairness. People really care about fairness. And the way you win arguments is by making them about fairness. And I think the issue right now is that some of the most powerful groups, if we're talking about fossil fuel companies or car drivers who don't want their parking spaces removed, are very loud and very powerful. But there honestly are not that many of them. So it's really important to highlight this difference of there are more young people who want a future and who want to be able to pursue the future they want than there are people who are blocking them. And it should not be the case that politicians listen more to the small, powerful group that screams the loudest. So it's about building the power and the message that you have, because you do have fairness on your side. So I just want to say that, and thank you for your work.
네, 너무너무 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for that encouragement.
네, 감사합니다. 제가 여기 조명이 많이 켜져 있다 보니까 시간 체크를 잘 못했는데 저희가
Alright, so
약 10분 정도, 5분 정도.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. So we wanted to hear more from other audiences as well, but as we have many questions prepared already, yeah, we wanted to ask the questions. And before we talk more about our prepared questions, that I'd like to ask the wrap up comments from Professor Nicholas. We have received actually a lot of questions, and some of the questions are, let me see. It was difficult to pick some of the questions, but let me see. I'd like to ask Professor Nicholas that between fear and hope, which one should be considered first? Which has more power? And that's the first question. And the second question is about the development in Russia. And because of the war between Russia and Ukraine, what is the impact to the planet? And I'd like to ask you. And when it comes to climate issues, that also diversity is considered important, diversity and sustainability. And how can we better connect these issues with sustainability of the planet, diversity and sustainability? And I would like to ask these questions to Professor. And after listening to her questions, and I also like to ask Professor to give the last message to Korean audiences. Please go ahead, Professor.
Thank you. So the question about hope and fear, it links back to some of the earlier comments about the importance of diversity in messaging and messengers. And I think the answer there is the best message, the most effective message is an authentic message. So if you feel hopeful, share hope. If you feel fearful, share your fear. It's not the case that there's one universal message that is the key to unlocking climate action. And we know from research that different messages resonate with different audiences. So I think the most important is to be honest and authentic for how you actually see the issue. Personally, I don't focus very much on hope or fear, either of them. I focus more on meaning and purpose, because I think that's what motivates me to get out of bed in the morning. And that's where people can actually see themselves. That is part of this incredibly important, meaningful collaboration at this, we're really playing a role that is so important for all of human history. And we have these opportunities to make a big difference. And I think that is really motivating and sustaining, whereas the emotions can come and go, and that's fine and natural, but we can't really depend on a specific emotion to motivate us. Regarding, let's see, the question of diversity, I think is critical, and I'm honored especially to join you and to hear from experiences in Korea, where it's important for me to understand the situation there. And I hope we can learn from each other, as I certainly have. I think touching on what journalist Kim said earlier, from what we see here in Sweden, talking to journalists here, what resonates the most and the stories that gets the most reads are stories that link climate to people's everyday lives. So it's really important to tell the big picture stories about the fires in California or the deforestation in the Amazon. But what engages people is what connects to their daily lives. So I think, as you mentioned, documenting witnesses who are noticing changes in fishing patterns or traditional ways of life, or particular places and kinds of foods, and the issues that people care about and can relate to and are important to them, and what they particularly can do in their current daily lives. That's how you start to unlock bigger system change. I guess I'll, there were so many good comments from earlier as well. I think, kind of wrapping up, we have this moment where we're in this race between tipping points, and we talked about the dangerous and catastrophic ecological and climate tipping points that we desperately need to avoid. And we talked about a positive social tipping point, where we, through our actions and through our work, reach a ripple effect and reach a sufficiently large number of people that society can actually transform and make this fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world. And of course, it's that second tipping point, the positive social tipping point, that we are all working towards. So I want to thank you for your work, and encourage you to keep going, to take care of yourselves, and make sure that you're supporting each other to stay in this work, which I know can be very difficult, but also I really believe is the most interesting and important time to ever be alive. And I hope that we seize this moment and do what's necessary. So thank you very much. And I would love to keep in touch with you. I've put the link to the best way to do that in the chat if you'd like to join. Thank you so much for having me.
김블레이 교수님 감사합니다.
Professor Nicholas, thank you very much. And as she mentioned at the last part, yes, there are tipping points that we are going toward, we're running toward, but we also that there are social tipping points. And I wish that we can achieve the positive tipping point. And this is the end of the 5th colloquium, and we are now holding the 5th colloquium, but next time that we're going to have more youth. We are going to include youth activists in this effort. So we're going to learn about what are the changes that they are making. So we look forward to the 6th colloquium. And I'd like to thank all the panelists. And especially I'd like to express my deep appreciation to Professor Nicholas, Kimberly Nicholas. And thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and your insights. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is the end of the session. Thank you. Bye-bye.